Shirley Pierce had always believed in justice. As a Supreme Court judge, she spent her life ensuring that the law was applied fairly, that the powerless had a voice, and that those who abused authority were held accountable. But she never expected to come home one day and find her own son, Jake, trapped inside their house because of a decision made by a group of arrogant bureaucrats. That morning had started like any other. She had rushed out the door, coffee in hand, already mentally preparing for a long day in court. Jake, her 10-year-old son, sat near the door in his wheelchair, beaming at her as he always did before she left for work. "See you later, Mom," he called cheerfully, rolling toward the living room where his books and video games waited. Shirley smiled, ruffled his hair, and reminded him to behave for Miss Smith, their elderly neighbor, who often watched him when she had long hearings. It wasn't until Miss Smith called after her that she noticed the white envelope taped to the door. "Another one from those homeowner association people," the woman said with a frown. Shirley sighed as she ripped it open. It was the third letter in the last month. Final violation notice. They were still insisting that she remove the wheelchair ramp she had installed for Jake, claiming it didn't comply with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. She had already responded, explaining that the ramp was necessary for her son's mobility and citing the Americans with Disabilities Act. But the Homeowner Association, led by its insufferable president Richard Dawson, refused to listen. Crumpling the letter, she shook her head. She had fought tougher battles in court. If they wanted to play this game, she was ready. By the time her hearing was over that afternoon, she had almost forgotten about the Homeowner Association's latest attempt to strong-arm her. But as she pulled into her driveway, an unsettling feeling crept into her chest. Something was wrong. She saw it immediately. The wheelchair ramp, the one that had given Jake the independence to enter and exit the house on his own, was gone. Not carefully dismantled, not stored away, destroyed. Wooden planks and metal railings lay in a shattered heap near the curb, like garbage waiting for pickup. Jagged remnants of nails still jutted out where the structure had once been securely fastened. A layer of dust coated the front steps. And then she saw Jake inside, near the door, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair, his face streaked with tears. Shirley barely registered throwing her car into park before she was at the door, her heart pounding. "What happened?" she demanded, looking between her son and Miss Smith, who stood beside him, her hands shaking with rage. "They just showed up, Shirley," the elderly woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "A group of men with tools. Said they were here on homeowner association orders. I tried to stop them, told them you weren't home, that this was your son's only way in and out, but they didn't care. They tore it all down right in front of him." Shirley knelt beside Jake, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, though the fury inside her was only growing. Jake sniffled, his lower lip trembling. I told them it was mine, that I needed it. But they just laughed, Mom. They didn't care." Shirley felt something inside her snap. This wasn't just about an homeowner association rule anymore. This wasn't about aesthetics or regulations. This was cruelty. They had humiliated her son. They had taken away his freedom. And Richard Dawson was going to regret every second of it. She didn't remember getting into her car. The drive to the Homeowner Association office was a blur of rage and white-hot fury. By the time she burst through the glass doors, every employee in the front office turned to stare. "Where is Richard Dawson?" she demanded, her voice carrying the sharp authority of a woman who had spent years commanding respect in the courtroom. The receptionist, a nervous-looking young woman, stammered, He's in a meeting right now." Shirley slammed her hand down on the counter so hard that the woman jumped. "Then you'd better tell him to end it. Now." A door down the hallway opened, and there he was, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, that smug, self-satisfied smirk already forming on his face. "Ah, Judge Pierce," he said smoothly, as if he had been expecting her. "What can I do for you?" Shirley stalked toward him, every muscle in her body coiled with restrained fury. You tore down my son's wheelchair ramp." Her words were slow, deliberate, each one laced with venom. Dawson didn't even blink. "It was a violation of homeowner association policy," he said casually. "We've sent you multiple notices." "I don't give a damn about your notices," she cut him off, stepping closer. "You had no right. That ramp was essential for my son. You just violated federal law, the ADA, and trust me, you do not want to find yourself in a legal battle with me." Dawson let out a small chuckle, shaking his head like she was a child throwing a tantrum. "Miss Pierce, I understand you're upset, but homeowner association rules are above personal preference. If we allow one person to break them, soon everyone will be installing whatever they please, and the neighborhood will lose its—" "A wheelchair ramp isn't a personal preference, you ignorant fool. It's a necessity." Dawson sighed dramatically, as if the conversation bored him. "Look, if it's that important to you, you can apply for an exemption. We'll review it at the next homeowner association meeting." Shirley let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" He raised an eyebrow. "I know you're a judge, and you think that makes you untouchable, but in this neighborhood, the homeowner association makes the rules." Shirley took another step forward, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "And in a court of law, I make the rules." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Dawson's face. Shirley leaned in slightly, her voice soft but deadly. "You think you can bully me, humiliate my son? Let's see how well that works out for you when you're drowning in lawsuits, national media attention, and a full-scale government investigation into how exactly you're managing homeowner association funds." Dawson swallowed, his smirk faltering. "Now, let's not be hasty." "Oh, we're past hasty," Shirley said, her voice ice-cold. "You've just declared war. And I promise you, you won't win." She turned on her heel and strode out of the office, leaving behind a stunned, pale-faced Dawson. The battle had just begun. Shirley barely noticed how she left the homeowner association office, her mind already calculating the next move. Dawson's arrogance, his belief that the homeowner association held absolute power, only fueled the fire burning inside her. He thought he could bully people into submission, that his rules were above federal law, that no one would dare challenge him. He was wrong. She would make sure of it. The drive home was a blur, her fingers gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she pulled onto her street, the sight of her house sent another wave of anger coursing through her. The shattered remnants of the wheelchair ramp still lay discarded near the curb, a pile of broken wood and twisted metal, as if it had never been anything more than an inconvenience to be swept away. But it wasn't just debris, it was Jake's freedom. The thought of her son trapped inside, unable to move beyond the threshold of his own home, made her stomach turn. Stepping out of the car, she took a deep breath, pushing down the fury threatening to consume her. Not here, not in front of Jake. She had to be strong for him. She spotted Miss Smith sitting beside him on the porch, her face etched with anger and concern. Jake's eyes met hers, searching, questioning. "Mom, are they going to build it back?" His voice was small, uncertain, carrying the weight of a child who had seen, too young, how cruel the world could be. Shirley knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "No, sweetheart, but we're going to make sure they never do this to anyone else again." She saw the flicker of hope in his eyes, and that was all she needed. That night, while Jake slept, Shirley sat in her home office, poring over legal documents, city ordinances, anything she could use. Miranda had already sent her the first round of research. Dawson had a pattern. He had forced people out of their homes over minor infractions, fined homeowners thousands of dollars for the most ridiculous reasons, shut down appeals before they even started. But the most damning discovery was the whispers of financial fraud. Misallocated funds, missing homeowner association dues, expenses that didn't add up. It wasn't solid evidence yet, but it was enough to make him sweat. A slow, satisfied smile spread across Shirley's lips. By morning, she had a plan. The first call she made was to a local news station. The second was to a disability rights attorney. The third was to a government watchdog agency that specialized in investigating corrupt housing organizations. Then she waited. By noon, the front yard was a flurry of activity. A news van parked outside, a reporter standing with a microphone in hand while a cameraman adjusted the shot. Jake sat nearby with Miss Smith, watching everything unfold with wide eyes. Shirley stood tall, her face calm but resolute, as the reporter began speaking. We're here today outside the home of Supreme Court Judge Shirley Pierce, who is currently in a legal battle with her homeowner association after they forcibly removed the wheelchair ramp her son relies on for mobility. Judge Pierce, tell us what happened. Shirley turned to the camera, her voice steady. Yesterday, while I was at work, a demolition crew hired by the homeowner association arrived at my home and destroyed the only access point my son had to enter and exit the house independently. They did this in direct violation of federal disability laws, and they did it knowing full well that my son relies on his wheelchair to move. The reporter's expression remained professional, but Shirley could see the outrage in her eyes. Do you believe this was a targeted action against you specifically? Shirley didn't hesitate. I believe this homeowner association, and particularly its president, Richard Dawson, have a long history of overstepping their legal authority. My case is not the first, but I intend to make sure it's the last. The interview continued, Shirley detailing every legal violation, making it clear that she was prepared to take this fight to court. The moment the cameras shut off, the footage was uploaded to the station's social media accounts. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By late afternoon, the phone calls started. The mayor's office, disability rights groups, former homeowners who had suffered under Dawson's reign, and then, finally, a number Shirley had been waiting for. An investigative journalist from a national outlet. This isn't just about your case, Judge Pierce, the voice on the other end of the line said. We've been following homeowner association corruption cases across the country. Dawson's name has come up before, but we never had enough to go on. If you're willing to go on record, we could take this nationwide. Shirley didn't even hesitate. I was hoping you'd say that. Meanwhile, at the homeowner association office, Richard Dawson was realizing just how badly he had miscalculated. His phone had been ringing non-stop, board members demanding explanations, homeowners calling in outrage. Someone had leaked internal homeowner association documents, exposing excessive fines and questionable financial transactions. The local council was asking questions, lawyers were requesting statements, and worst of all, his name was trending on social media. By the time he saw Shirley's interview, his hands were sweating. He had expected her to file an appeal, maybe request a hearing, something easy to dismiss. He hadn't expected a full-scale media firestorm. Panic set in as he grabbed his phone and dialed the number he had hoped he'd never need. His personal attorney. The line connected, and before the man could even greet him, Dawson muttered through gritted teeth, "We have a problem," his lawyer sighed. "You think?" "That judge is going to bury you, Richard. You need to settle this, now." Dawson clenched his jaw. "I don't settle." There was a long pause. Then the lawyer exhaled, his voice flat. "Then you better prepare for the worst." But Dawson wasn't prepared. Not for what was coming next. The pressure on Richard Dawson was mounting by the hour. Calls flooded his office, emails poured in, and board members, once complacent and eager to enforce his will, were now panicked and demanding answers. News outlets had picked up the story, and his name was being dragged through the mud. More troubling than the media spectacle, however, were the whispers of a legal inquiry into the homeowner association's finances. Dawson had spent years carefully cultivating his power, weaving a web of influence that kept homeowners afraid and obedient. But now cracks were forming, and for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar. He had spent the morning in a closed-door emergency meeting with the homeowner association board, trying to contain the damage. His usual confident demeanor was cracking, his voice sharp as he paced the length of the conference room. This is a media stunt. That woman is using her position to turn a simple compliance issue into a federal case, he snapped. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't working. One of the board members, an older man named Sanders, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Richard, this is bigger than just one homeowner. I've been getting calls from people saying they're considering a class action lawsuit. They're accusing the homeowner association of unlawful fines, coercion. Hell, some of them are even talking about taking this to the state attorney's office. Dawson's hands clenched into fists. He had built this homeowner association into a machine, a profitable and powerful entity that controlled every aspect of this neighborhood. He couldn't let it crumble now. Another board member, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair, shook her head. And then there's the money. If Pierce digs into the financials, she's going to find things we can't explain away. We need to settle. Publicly apologize, rebuild the ramp, and put this to rest before it spirals out of control. Dawson shot her a sharp look. Absolutely not. The second we admit wrongdoing, we lose control. This woman thinks she can strong-arm us because she's a judge. She's underestimated just how much influence we have. He turned to his assistant, who was waiting in the corner, silent and watching with wide eyes. Get me a meeting with the mayor. I want to make sure the city knows we are handling this. The assistant hesitated. Sir, the mayor's office has already issued a statement. They're distancing themselves from the homeowner association. Dawson felt his stomach drop. What? She swallowed hard. They're saying they support any investigation into homeowner association governance and compliance with disability laws. Silence filled the room. Dawson's face darkened. He knew what this meant. The city saw which way the wind was blowing, and they weren't going to back him. With his usual avenues of power slipping through his fingers, Dawson did the only thing left that he knew. He went on the offensive. That afternoon, a press release was sent out on behalf of the homeowner association, calling the controversy a miscommunication and stating that the ramp removal had been done in accordance with neighborhood regulations. Dawson had hoped the statement would calm things down. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. The media pounced on it. Legal experts tore apart the language, calling it weak and legally indefensible. Disability rights organizations issued blistering statements condemning the homeowner association. Shirley Pierce, ever the strategist, remained silent, letting the public rage build on its own. Then the lawsuit started. A group of homeowners, many of whom had suffered under Dawson's rule, officially filed a civil suit alleging fraud, discrimination, and financial misconduct. Worse yet, a state senator publicly announced his support for an investigation into homeowner associations abusing power. Shirley's case was no longer just a headline. It was the spark that set off something much bigger. Dawson's world was collapsing, but he wasn't ready to give up. That evening, he sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the numbers on his computer screen. He knew there were irregularities in the homeowner association's financials. Money had been shifted, funds misallocated, questionable expenses hidden behind bureaucratic loopholes. If anyone took a serious look, it wouldn't take long for them to find everything. His lawyer had been right. He needed to settle. But Dawson wasn't the kind of man who backed down without a fight. If he was going down, he was taking Pierce with him. The next morning, before the sun had even fully risen, a cease and desist letter arrived at Shirley's doorstep. Dawson was threatening legal action, accusing her of defamation, libel, and inciting harassment against the homeowner association. The document was carefully worded, dripping with legal jargon meant to intimidate. But Shirley was a Supreme Court judge. She had seen this tactic 1,000 times before. Instead of fear, she felt amusement. Sitting at her kitchen table, she skimmed through the letter, sipping her coffee, then casually tossed it onto the counter. She dialed her attorney, placing the phone on speaker. They finally made their move, she said, her tone light. Her lawyer chuckled. Oh, I saw. They really think this is going to scare you? Shirley smirked. They're desperate. Then let's turn up the heat. That afternoon, Shirley did the one thing Dawson feared most. She announced that she would be filing criminal complaints against the homeowner association for violating federal disability laws. The moment the news broke, the internet erupted. Within hours, legal experts were discussing potential felony charges. Homeowners were coming forward with more allegations. The homeowner association board was scrambling. And Dawson? He was watching everything he had built fall apart. For the first time, he realized he had already lost. Richard Dawson sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk, his thoughts a chaotic mess. The homeowner association was unraveling before his eyes, and for the first time, he couldn't see a way out. He had built his power carefully over the years, surrounding himself with a board that would never question him, manipulating homeowners into submission with fines, rules, and legal loopholes. Now, everything was slipping through his fingers. Shirley Pierce had set off a firestorm he hadn't been prepared for, and the worst part was, he had underestimated her. He had thought she would be like the others, angry, sure, but ultimately powerless. He had thought he could outmaneuver her. Instead, she had turned public opinion against him so thoroughly that even the mayor's office had distanced itself from the homeowner association. The lawsuits piling up against him weren't just from Pierce anymore. Other homeowners had joined the fight, emboldened by the exposure. Investigative journalists were digging into every financial transaction he had ever approved. The city was launching an audit. The state attorney general's office had made a statement about looking into possible criminal activity. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. His lawyer. He let it ring, knowing exactly what the call would be about. The night before, he had sent out cease and desist letters, thinking it might scare Pierce into backing off. It had done the opposite. She had laughed in the face of his legal threat, turned it into fuel for her campaign against him, and now the entire country was watching as a Supreme Court judge publicly dismantled him piece by piece. Dawson exhaled sharply, standing up and moving toward the window. Outside, the pristine streets of the community he had ruled over for years stretched before him, the houses all identical, the lawns all neatly trimmed. It had once felt like his kingdom. Now it felt like a cage. The phone rang again. This time, he picked it up. "Tell me something I want to hear," he said, before his lawyer could even speak. A sigh came from the other end. "You're out of options, Richard. The criminal complaints Pierce filed, they have merit. The homeowner association's financials are a mess, and the city's auditors are going to find everything. We can fight the civil lawsuits, delay things, but the moment they uncover fraud, you're looking at prison time." Dawson clenched his jaw. He had known it was bad, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way he wasn't ready for. "So what are you suggesting? That I roll over, that I beg Pierce for mercy?" His lawyer hesitated. "You need to resign. Step down from the homeowner association. Let someone else take the fall for the financial mismanagement. If you leave now, before the full audit is complete, you might be able to avoid criminal charges, maybe even negotiate a private settlement with Pierce to keep this from escalating further." Resigned. The word tasted like acid in his mouth. He had spent years building his reputation, cementing his control over this neighborhood. He had thought himself untouchable. And now? Now he was being told to walk away. His grip tightened around the phone. "No," the lawyer groaned. "No," Dawson repeated, his voice steely. "I don't run. I don't fold just because some judge thinks she can play hero." He hung up before the lawyer could argue further, his heart hammering in his chest. He wouldn't go down like this. He refused to. At that moment, his email chimed. He turned back to his desk, opening the message out of habit more than anything else. As soon as he saw the sender's name, his stomach twisted. The State Attorney General's office. He clicked the email open, his pulse roaring in his ears. It was brief, clinical, a formal notice that an official investigation had been launched into the homeowner association's financial dealings and its enforcement practices. He barely finished reading before another email arrived, this one from the local news station. They were requesting a comment on the criminal investigation. Dawson's breath came fast, shallow. He had thought he had time. He had thought he could still control the narrative. But the walls were closing in faster than he had ever anticipated. He grabbed his coat, storming out of his office, ignoring the nervous glances from the few staff members still loyal to him. He needed air. He needed to think. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, but he could feel the shift. Homeowners who once avoided eye contact with him now watched him openly, some whispering to each other. He could see it in their faces. The fear was gone. They weren't afraid of him anymore. That terrified him more than anything. He reached his car, yanking the door open when a voice stopped him. "Running away, Dawson?" He turned sharply. Shirley Pierce stood a few feet away, arms crossed, gaze unwavering. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her expression. Certainty. She had already won, and they both knew it. Dawson forced himself to smirk. "Enjoying your little crusade, Judge?" Shirley didn't blink. "I enjoy seeing justice served, and from where I'm standing, it's about to hit you like a freight train." His fingers curled around the car door. "You think you've won?" "This isn't over." She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're right, it's not. Not until you're held accountable for every single person you've bullied, every family you've driven out, every dollar you've stolen from this community. And trust me, Dawson, I will see this through." Something inside him snapped. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You're just another arrogant judge who thinks the law is some holy scripture. You have no idea what it takes to actually run a community." Shirley tilted her head slightly. "A community? Or your personal kingdom?" He had no answer for that. Before he could say another word, the sound of an approaching vehicle made them both turn. A black sedan with government plates pulled up to the curb. Two men in suits stepped out, their eyes locked on to Dawson. "Richard Dawson?" one of them said, holding up a badge. Dawson's stomach plummeted. "We have a warrant to seize all homeowner association financial records and conduct an audit of this office. You'll need to come with us for questioning." Shirley exhaled, shaking her head. "Told you," she murmured. Dawson's mind raced, grasping for an escape route, a loophole, anything. But there was none. The moment he saw his own reflection in the car window, he knew. This was the end. He had spent years making other people feel powerless. Now, he finally understood how they felt. The silence inside the interrogation room was suffocating. Richard Dawson sat rigidly in the metal chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Across from him, a state investigator methodically flipped through a stack of papers. Financial statements, internal homeowner association documents, legal complaints, all of them painting a damning picture of corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. Dawson had barely spoken since he was brought in, keeping his face impassive, his lawyer seated beside him, stiff and silent. The room smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic sterility, a place where people like him didn't belong, where he had never belonged. Yet, here he was. The investigator finally stopped flipping through the documents and leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Mr. Dawson, I'll be direct with you. We've uncovered substantial financial irregularities in the homeowner association's accounts. Unauthorized expenses, misappropriated funds, fines that were never accounted for. We have witness testimonies from former board members who claim you pressured them into enforcing illegal fines and evicting homeowners under fabricated violations. If this goes to trial, you're looking at felony charges." He let the words settle, watching Dawson carefully. "Now, you can either cooperate or we can proceed with a full-blown criminal case against you. Your choice." Dawson's lawyer, a seasoned man with a face hardened by years of damage control, cleared his throat. "My client is willing to discuss the possibility of a settlement. If we—" The investigator shook his head. "It's too late for that." He turned a page in his file. "And then there's the ADA violation. Destroying a wheelchair ramp? That alone carries significant legal consequences. Judge Pierce has filed complaints at both the federal and state level. You don't just have a financial scandal on your hands. You've got a civil rights lawsuit coming, and she's not the type to back down. Dawson felt something snap inside him. The rage, the indignation, the disbelief that someone like him, who had built something, who had controlled an entire community, was now being talked down to like some common criminal. His fingers clenched into fists as he spoke for the first time. This is a witch hunt. His voice was homeowner association hers, but he pushed forward. That woman is using her position to settle a personal vendetta. I did nothing illegal. The investigator arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. So the missing money, the fraudulent fines, the illegal foreclosures, those just happened on their own? Dawson glared at him but said nothing. His lawyer sighed. Richard, if you fight this, you're going to lose. For the first time, the words truly sank in. Lose. The thought made his stomach churn. Outside the station, the world was already moving on without him. The new homeowner association board, hastily assembled after Dawson's arrest, had issued a public statement promising sweeping reforms. Investigators were picking through every financial transaction he had ever touched, peeling back years of misconduct. Homeowners who had once feared him were celebrating his downfall. And then there was Shirley Pierce. She stood at the heart of it all, the woman who had ripped his kingdom apart, who had turned the entire neighborhood, and now the entire state, against him. While he sat inside an interrogation room, she was outside, giving statements to the press, meeting with disability rights groups, watching as her fight for justice reshaped everything he had built. And Jake, her son, the boy whose wheelchair ramp had been nothing more than an inconvenience to Dawson, was free again. Dawson exhaled sharply, staring at the table in front of him, his mind racing. He had spent years bending the rules, silencing opposition, believing himself untouchable. But in the end, he hadn't been outplayed by another businessman or politician. He had been outplayed by a mother fighting for her son. Outside the station, Shirley stood in front of a crowd of reporters, the weight of the last few weeks settling on her shoulders. The battle had been brutal, exhausting, but she had won. The new homeowner association board had officially reinstated Jake's wheelchair ramp, a small but powerful symbol of what had changed. And more than that, they had agreed to overhaul the homeowner association's entire structure, implementing strict oversight measures to prevent another Dawson from ever rising to power again. The lawsuits against Dawson and the previous board members would take months, maybe years to resolve, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that people weren't afraid anymore. The community had woken up. They had seen what unchecked power could do, and they had fought back. As Shirley turned away from the reporters, she felt a small hand slip into hers. Jake stood beside her, looking up at her with a quiet kind of pride. "We did it, Mom," he said softly. Shirley smiled down at him, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we did." At that moment, she knew. This fight had never been about just one ramp. It had been about standing up against injustice, about proving that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law. And in the end, justice had prevailed.